Henry Garcia, as fingers left wet handprints on the subway tunnel window, emitting sour ozone and burnt hair breeze amidst the high-pitched whistling that made his teeth ache. The sound wasn't just in his ears, it vibrated behind his eyes, a needle of 327 hertz scraping against his skull. He pressed his palm harder against the cold glass, the damp smearing the grimy view of cracked tile and dripping water. Just another shift heat, he told himself, the air thick with the smell of old metal and something else, like hair left too long on a stove. The whistling intensified, a thin metallic rasp that made his scalp prickle. He turned away, the tunnel as fluorescent lights flickering like dying fireflies. 3 more hours. Just 3 more hours, asterisk. He stepped over a puddle, the water slick and unnaturally warm. The floorboards beneath his boots felt soft, not warped wood, but something yielding, like the surface of a wound. He stopped, bent down. The tile was stained a moldy bread yellow, the grout crumbling. He scraped a finger against it. Dust. But the dust smelled of ozone, sharp and wrong. The whistling rose again, a thin, persistent sound that made his head throb. Faint like a cat, as purr turned inside out, he thought. The thought absurd, but the image of a white cat with blood-stained paws flickered in his mind. He'd seen it earlier near the service door, a ghost of a cat. He walked toward the closed door at the tunnel's end. It stood slightly ajar, the metal frame rusted, the wood beneath it dark with age. The air around it smelled stronger, burnt hair, ozone, and beneath it, the coppery tang of fresh blood. His breath hitched. Just a stray, a kitten, no one's cat. Asterisk, but the thought felt hollow. The whistling pulsed, a physical pressure in his sinuses. He reached for the door handle. It was cold, slick with condensation. He pushed. The door swung open inside. The tunnel ended abruptly at a dead wall, but the white cat sat perfectly still, facing the wall, its paws pressed against the threshold. The blood-stained prints were fresh, smeared across the concrete, not dried. It lifted its head. One paw was dark, wet, the blood still glistening. It didn't look at him, it looked past him, toward the wall. The whistling reached a fever pitch, a high, thin sound that made his ears bleed. He felt it in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. Sang to top it. Just stop. Asterisk, the cat turned its head fully. Its eyes were dark, reflecting the dim light. Then it stepped forward, one paw lifting, then the other. The blood smeared across the concrete, a trail leading toward the wall. The cat vanished through the wall, not into the wall, but through. It as if the wall was merely a curtain. Henry stumbled back. The door slammed shut behind him. He whirled. The cat was gone. The blood-stained prints were still there, on the threshold. Fresh, the whistling cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. Only the sound of his own breathing, ragged and loud. The air smelled of burnt hair and ozone. The floorboards beneath his boots felt soft again, yielding. He looked down. The moldy bread yellow stain spread, just a little. The prints on the threshold were bleeding into the concrete, the blood seeping into the floor like a slow, wet stain. The cat was gone. The prints remained. The whistling was gone. Only the smell of burnt hair and the floorboard's soft, fleshy give. He stood there, fingers pressed against the cold metal of the door, the blood-stained prints glowing faintly in the dim light. The prints were spreading. The air tasted of iron and something else, something akin to burnt sugar, but wrong. The key felt heavy in my palm, cold against my skin. It wasn't the weight of brass, but of something denser, older. The human eye embedded in the bow shui, a milky opalescent gray, seemed to swivel, to follow my movements. Not with intent, not with malice, but with a blank, unsettling observation. The tunnel narrowed here, the ceiling low enough that I had to stoop. The fluorescent lights flickered again, a stuttering pulse of sickly yellow. 3 more hours, I repeated, the thought a brittle shield against the growing unease. The whistling started again, not as a sound, but as a vibration. It resonated in my teeth, a high-pitched whine that climbed the scale of discomfort until it fractured, splitting into 1,000 shards of sound. Each shard was a retinal flash, a momentary searing of white light behind my eyes. I squeezed my eyes shut, the key digging into my palm. The smell intensified, 2D burnt sugar, ozone, and a faint metallic tang. My boots landed on something yielding, not the usual grit of the tunnel floor, but something soft. I glanced down. The concrete beneath my feet was shifting, the moldy bread yellow stain spreading like a bruise. It felt Wrong. I knelt, pressing a finger into the surface. It wasn't concrete, it was pliable. Like flesh, the whistling intensified, a chorus of needles scraping against my skull. Like a hive of insects trapped in my sinuses, and I thought, the image fleeting and unwelcome. The tunnel ended here abruptly. A solid wall of brick and mortar stained with years of grime, but there, embedded in the wall, was a doorway. Not a proper doorway, but a distortion, a shimmering ripple in the air, and within that distortion the cat. It sat perfectly still, facing the wall, its white fur a stark contrast against the dark brick. The blood-stained prints on the threshold were fresh, the crimson glistening in the dim light. I took a step closer, the whistling rising to a fever pitch. The key felt heavier now, a lead weight in my hand. The eye in the bow seemed to focus, to lock onto mine. I felt a jolt, a sudden disorientation, a sensation of falling. The floorboards beneath my boots softened further, the yielding sensation spreading up my legs. They felt like gelatin. A tremor ran through my body, a vibration that wasn't sound, but something deeper, something primal. The cat didn't acknowledge me. It simply stared at the wall, its dark eyes reflecting the distorted light. Then, it lifted its head, a slow, deliberate movement. The blood on its paw glistened, a dark mirror reflecting my own distorted face. It didn't blink. It didn't flinch. It simply watched-eyed. The whistling reached a point of unbearable intensity, a physical pressure against my temples. The retinal flashes were constant now, a strobe of white light obliterating my vision. I stumbled back, the key slipping in my sweaty palm. I caught myself on the wall, the rough brick scraping against my skin. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of burnt sugar, and something else, something acrid and unsettling. The cat took a step forward, then another. The blood smeared across the floor, a crimson trail leading directly to the shimmering doorway. It vanished through the distortion, not into it, but through it. It as if the wall were merely a curtain. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. A silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The air hung still, heavy with the smell of burnt sugar and decay. I stood there, breathing hard, the key clutched in my hand. The doorway remained, a shimmering distortion in the brick wall. I looked down. The floorboards beneath my boots were no longer concrete. They were soft, yielding, gelatinous. The moldy bread-yellow stain had spread, engulfing my feet. It was warm, unnervingly so. I felt a tremor run through the floor, a subtle vibration that resonated in my bones. The prints on the threshold were still there, fresh, the blood seeping into the gelatinous surface like a slow, wet stain. The cat was gone. The prints remained. The whistling was gone. Only the smell of burnt sugar and the floorboard's soft, fleshy give. I pressed against the cold metal of the wall, the blood-stained prints glowing faintly in the dim light. The prints were spreading, the key pressed against my palm like a living thing, its brass surface slick with something that wasn't sweat. I'd held it too long, the weight of it sinking into my bones. The tunnel's air hung thick, a stale breath of iron and something else sour, like the inside of a dead man's mouth. The whistling started again, not from outside but from inside my skull. A high, reedy note vibrating in my teeth, my jaw, my fillings. It matched my pulse now, syncopated, a metronome of wrongness. I knelt, pressing the key's bow against the wall. The brick was cold, but not solid. It gave beneath the pressure, a slow, wet sound like the scrape of a spoon against bone. The eye in the bow stared at me, unblinking. I didn't look away. The drill bit was already in my pocket, a stubby thing of steel, the kind used for soft wood. I fitted the key into the chuck, the metal biting into the brass, a sharp fucklick tiss. The whistling rose in pitch, a needle scraping glass. The first drill press was a shudder, a vibration that traveled up my arms. The brick didn't crack. It breathed. A thin seam of moldy bread, yellow ooze welled up around the bit, sticky and warm. The texture was wrong, like crushed grain, but not grain. More like the inside of a rotten melon, pulpy and fibrous. I leaned closer, the smell hitting me first, burnt hair but deeper, older, the stink of a corpse left too long in the sun. The whistling pulsed in time with the drill, a living thing, a heartbeat. The hole widened. The ooze thickened, glistening. I could see the texture now, fibers, threads, something like muscle. Not brick, not concrete. Flesh. The whistling split into 3 notes, a dissonant chord that made my ears ring. I pulled back, the drill still spinning, the key locked in place. The wall pulsed, the fibers contracting like a living thing. A single crumb of the ooze broke free, drifting toward my face on a slow, wet current. It landed on my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. The crumb was warm, almost alive. I pressed a finger to it, and it dissolved into a greasy paste, the texture of crushed bone. The whistling stopped. The silence was worse. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The key in my hand was heavier now, the brass cold against my skin. The hole in the wall yawned wider, the ooze seeping like syrup, pooling at my feet. And then the crumb on my cheek moved. The gear fragment lay nestled in the ooze, a dull brass glint against the bread-yellow slime. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of my thumb, but the teeth along its circumference were disturbingly precise, each a miniature saw blade. The whistling hadn't stopped. It wasn't in my ears anymore. It was sever them, a physical pressure against my skull, a vibration that rattled my teeth. It was the same pitch as the drill, only now layered, a dissonant chorus that threatened to shatter something within me. I knelt, the ooze cold and slick against my trousers. The air tasted like burnt hair, a phantom scent that clung to the back of my throat. The crumb of something still clung to my cheek, a greasy residue I couldn't bring myself to wipe away. It felt expectant. I tried to recall the last few hours, the tunnel, the key, the drill, the cat. It was all a blur, a sequence of actions divorced from intention. Like watching a film of someone else's life, the gear pulsed faintly, a subtle shimmer that distorted the air around it. It seemed to feed one something. A hunger radiated from it, a silent demand that resonated with the whistling in my head. I felt a compulsion, a sudden urge to reach out, to touch it. My hand moved before my will could register the intention. The metal was cold, surprisingly smooth. As my fingers brushed against the gear, a jolt ran up my arm, a sharp, localized pain that bloomed into a spreading numbness. The whistling intensified, the pressure against my skull becoming almost unbearable. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing against the onslaught. When I opened them, the gear was no longer in my hand. It was Sufitun me. The teeth had latched onto my wrist, digging into the skin with a metallic rasp. Not a clean bite, but a slow grinding purchase, like a predator testing its grip. I tried to pull it off, but it held fast, the brass warm against my flesh. A line of viscous bread-yellow fluid oozed from the point of contact, staining my skin. The air thickened, the smell of burnt hair intensifying, laced with something else now fruity or sharp, acrid tang that stung my nostrils. The floorboards beneath me shifted, a subtle undulation that sent a wave of nausea through me. They felt wrong, not solid, but yielding, like flesh. I pressed a hand down, and the surface gave way slightly, a sickening squish beneath my weight. The whistling warped, bending into a new, higher register, a keening wail that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. I looked down, and the ooze pooling at my feet had begun to flow, spreading across the floor like a living tide. It wasn't just flowing, it was some breathing. Slow, rhythmic expansions and contractions, like the rise and fall of a chest. The bread-yellow color deepened, taking on a sickly bruised hue. The floorboards pulsed in response, the texture shifting, becoming more organic. The cat watched from the shadows, its blood-stained paws silent on the pulsing floor. Its eyes, twin points of emerald fire, seemed to bore into me, judging. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its gaze, a weight pressing down on me, a silent accusation. My mind felt distant, detached. I registered the scene before me, footy the pulsing floor, the oozing slime, the gear embedded in my wrist 20. But it felt as if I were observing it through a pane of glass. A dream. A nightmare. The gear on my wrist began to rotate slowly at first, then faster, the teeth grinding against my skin. The pain was a constant, throbbing ache, but it was overshadowed by the rising panic, the suffocating sense of dread. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, a strangled gasp lost in the whistling. I looked down at my wrist. The gear was no longer just attached, it was sundergrating. The flesh around the teeth was melding with the brass, the skin disappearing, absorbed into the metal. A new line of the bread-yellow ooze pulsed from the wound, weaving its way up my arm, spreading like a disease. I felt a strange detachment, a sense of inevitability. This wasn't happening to me, it was happening through me. The whistling reached a fever pitch, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sensation. The floorboards beneath me convulsed, the pulsing becoming more violent, more frantic. I felt a strange lightness, a sense of rising as if I were being lifted, drawn upwards. The last thing I saw was the cat's emerald eyes, reflecting the pulsing ooze, the gear embedded in my wrist, and a distorted image of my own face, slowly dissolving into the bread-yellow slime. The key's echo lingered. I traced the moldy bread streaks with my gloved fingers, their texture like dampened velvet under my touch. They cover 30% of the tunnel walls, a sickening yellow that seems to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsating as if alive. The air here is thick, the smell of burnt hair acrid on my tongue, mingling with something else, a subtle tang of decay, like old bread left out too long. The whistling intensifies, vibrating through the soles of my boots, resonating in my chest cavity. It is not just sound, it is a physical presence, a pressure that makes my bones ache. The floorboards beneath me tremble, their surface shifting into a drumhead tautness, each vibration sending ripples across the wood like shockwaves through water. I pause at one particularly large streak, its width spanning nearly 3 feet. It pulses with warmth against my fingertips, a faint throb that matches the rhythm of the whistling. A metallic rasp echoes down the tunnel, growing louder as it approaches. Not nails on glass this time, but something heavier, more insistent. The cat appears at the mouth of the tunnel, its white fur stained crimson with blood that never seems to dry or fade away. Its emerald eyes lock onto mine, a silent judgment in their depths. It doesn't move, just watches me from afar as I trace the streaks, waiting for something, or perhaps warning against it. The whistling reaches a fever pitch, and suddenly there is silence, not absence of sound, but an oppressive presence that seems to muffle all noise except my own ragged breath. The cat turns around abruptly, its tail flicking once before disappearing into the shadows beyond the reach of my lantern light. I feel a chill run down my spine at its sudden departure. Then, silence breaks with a wet thud behind me. A new bloodstain appears on my ATC logbook, seeping through the paper like ink through watercolor. It is not large, perhaps an inch in diameter, but it is enough to send a jolt of fear coursing through my veins. The whistling resumes, softer now, almost satisfied. The floorboards beneath me undulate again, their surface softening further until they feel like flesh underfoot. I look down at the ooze pooling around my boots. It is not just flowing anymore, it is breathing, expanding and contracting rhythmically as if drawing air into unseen lungs. The bread, yellow color, deepens to a sickly bruise, purple hue. I reach out tentatively towards one of the streaks with my free hand. It feels like velvet still, but now there is an underlying warmth that seems to throb against my fingertips. As I touch it, gently tracing its length from top to bottom, something shifts beneath me. A subtle undulation underfoot, followed by a sudden lurch, upward as if caught in the grip of some unseen force. And then everything goes dark. Not just because lantern light flickers out or because tunnel walls close in, but darkness that seems to swallow all sight and sound, leaving only an echoing emptiness where reality once was. The key, echo lingers. The brass key felt cold, almost brittle against my palm. Not the cold of the tunnel's sun. That was a damp, pervasive chill sent wine, but something deeper, a chill that seemed to originate within the metal itself. I positioned the flathead screwdriver, the tip worn smooth from years of use, against the ornate bow. The eye embedded there, milky and vacant, stared up at me. It wasn't glass. The material felt organic, yielding slightly under pressure. The whistling, a high-pitched whine that had settled into the background of my consciousness like tinnitus, suddenly sharpened. Not in volume, but in texture. It fractured, splintering into 1,000 tiny needles of sound, each one piercing my skull with focused precision. A water bottle, forgotten and half full near my kit, vibrated on the damp concrete, then shattered. Not a violent explosion, but a clean break, the glass scattering like crystalline dust. The sound didn't echo, it simply stopped, absorbed by the tunnel's oppressive silence. I applied more pressure to the screwdriver. The brass resisted, then yielded with a groan. A minute fracture appeared around the eye socket, a hairline crack radiating outwards. The metal felt wrong, not just hard but dense, like trying to manipulate a piece of bone. I increased my leverage, bracing my wrist against the rough concrete wall. The whistling intensified, morphing into a sustained shriek. The air tasted metallic, a faint tang of copper coating my tongue. Then, the screwdriver began to bend. It wasn't a gradual flex, a yielding of the steel. It was a deliberate contortion, the metal flowing, reshaping itself under my hand. The shaft elongated, thinning, the flathead twisting and curving. It wasn't bending, it was growing, reforming. The polished steel lost its sheen, becoming dull and porous like aged ivory. The tip sharpened, curving inwards, elongating into a wickedly pointed barb. It felt less like a tool, and more like a claw. A metallic gleam appeared along the newly formed edge, catching the weak light of my headlamp. It wasn't reflection, it was luminescence, a faint, internal glow. I stared, my grip tightening, then loosening, then tightening again. The whistling reached a crescendo, a sustained, unbearable pitch. The floor beneath me shifted again, not the subtle undulation from before, but a definite lurch, as if the entire tunnel were breathing. The mold streaks pulsed with a deeper, bruised purple now, the texture becoming less like velvet and more like skin. I could feel the heat radiating from the key, a feverish warmth that seeped through my gloves. The transformed screwdriver, now a grotesque parody of its former self, felt heavy, impossibly heavy. I tried to release it, but my fingers seemed fused to the handle, the metal molding itself around my flesh. The barb, now fully formed, pressed against my palm, not painfully but insistently, as if urging me to continue to finish the task. The tunnel walls seemed to be closing in, the mold creeping down from the ceiling, the air growing thick and viscous. The whistling cut off, replaced by a low resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. The hum intensified, resonating in my chest cavity, constricting my breathing. I could feel the concrete beneath my boots softening, giving way, becoming pliant and yielding. It felt like standing on flesh. The key's eyes seemed to widen, the milky white surface becoming translucent. I could see something moving within, a dark, swirling vortex. The screwdriver, now fully transformed, pulsed with the same sickly purple as the mold. It felt alive, a grotesque extension of my own hand. A tremor ran through my body and everything went dark. Not a fading of light, but a complete, utter absence of sight. The darkness wasn't empty, though. It was filled with a suffocating pressure, a sense of being swallowed whole. The transformed screwdriver, now a claw, dug into the palm of my hand, and then silence, a complete cessation of sound. The floorboards beneath me undulated again, their surface softening further until they felt like flesh underfoot. The key's bow, now a single, seamless curve of bone-like material, pressed against my temple, a wet thud behind me. The key's echo lingered. I stumbled over it, a hidden mechanical conduit beneath the tunnel floor, its edge catching my boot like an open mouth. It was dark down there, darker than the already oppressive gloom of the subway tunnel. My headlamp beam stabbed into the void but found only more darkness, as if the light itself were swallowed whole. The cat's footsteps echoed off the conduit walls, a high-pitched whistling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like walking through a flute played by an unseen musician, each step resonating with a piercing note that set my teeth on edge. The air tasted of burnt hair and ozone, the scent coating my tongue like ash. I reached out tentatively, fingers brushing against cold metal. It felt damp under my touch, slick as skin. I could hear something moving inside, a rhythmic thrum, thum, thrum, thum, thrum, like a heartbeat slowed down to an unnatural tempo. The sound vibrated through the conduit walls, resonating in my bones. The whistling grew louder, filling the tunnel completely until it was all I could hear. It felt alive, that whistle, sentient and malevolent. It seemed to anticipate me, each note rising as if demanding entry into some unseen realm beyond the concrete confines of the subway system. I tried to step back, but my boot caught on something, a lip or edge hidden in the darkness. I stumbled, arms flailing for balance, catching myself against the conduit wall. The metal groaned under my weight. Then, with a sudden wet sucking sound, it began to close around me like an iris, shuttering open. Panic surged through me, hot and electric. I scrambled back, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel walls were too narrow for retreat. The whistling reached a crescendo, piercing my skull until all rational thought ceased. There was only instinct now, primal fear driving my actions as I tried in vain to force open the conduit doors. But they didn't budge. Instead, with another wet suction sound, they slid shut, sealing me inside. The darkness was absolute this time, not even a glimmer of light penetrating from outside. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing loudly in the confined space as I reached for my headlamp only to find it crushed beneath my chest plate. I was trapped. I tore at it with my fingers, the bread yielding with a damp, yielding sigh. It wasn't bread, not exactly. More like compressed dust and mold, the color of a forgotten cellar. The texture was unsettlingly soft, like pressing into something that should have resisted. The tunnel air, already thick with the scent of burnt hair, now carried a musty sweetness, the aroma of decay blooming in the confined space. I needed to obscure my vision, not for any tactical reason, but because the geometry of this place felt wrong. The angles weren't right, the curves too generous, the concrete itself seemed to breathe. The whistling had resolved. No longer a chaotic flurry of sound, it was now a single, sustained note, a high-pitched keening that resonated deep within my skull. It didn't hurt, not precisely. It was more like a pressure, a tightening band around my temples, forcing my thoughts inward, stifling any attempt at rational assessment. My hands moved automatically, pulling free a generous strip of the bread-like substance. It flaked and crumbled, leaving a fine gray residue on my fingertips. The material felt cool, almost refrigerated, and strangely, porous. I brought the strip to my face. The initial contact was a shock. Not cold, as I'd anticipated, but tepid, like touching something that had been held in another's hand for too long. I pressed it against my lips, then over my mouth, the moldy mass clinging to my skin. The taste was faint, metallic, and faintly sweet. The scent intensified, filling my nostrils, coating my tongue. It wasn't unpleasant, not at first. It was familiar, like a half-remembered dream, a forgotten childhood snack. My hands continued to move, driven by a detached clinical urgency. The strip of bread stuff was plastered over my nose, then my cheeks. It felt less like a covering and more like an extension of my own flesh, the porous texture merging with the pores of my skin. I was losing sight of the tunnel, not because of darkness, but because the bread was obscuring my vision, turning the world into a swirling gray haze. I reached for another piece, larger this time. It came away easily, the material detaching from the wall with a wet, sucking sound. The walls weren't concrete, or not entirely. They yielded slightly under pressure, the surface giving way like a thin membrane stretched over something soft and yielding underneath. I pressed a finger against the wall and felt a subtle give, a slight depression in the surface. It felt organic. The floor beneath my boots was doing the same. The whistling continued unwavering, a constant drone that seemed to seep into my bones. It wasn't just my ears that were affected. I could feel it in my teeth, in the marrow of my spine, in the very core of my being. My air traffic controller's brain, usually focused on the precise coordinates of airborne metal, was overwhelmed. The usual calm, the detached calculation, had dissolved into a strange, numb acceptance. I was simply observing, documenting, cataloging the unfolding events. The bread now covered my eyes. The darkness was complete, not the absence of light, but a thick, suffocating darkness, a tangible presence that pressed against my eyelids. I could still sense the tunnel, a vague, distorted impression of its shape and size. But it wasn't the tunnel I remembered. It was shifting, changing, twisting. The walls seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat. The floor felt like flesh. I stumbled forward, blindly navigating the narrow space. My hands brushed against the walls, encountering the soft, yielding surface. It was warm now, almost feverish. The whistling intensified, vibrating through my skull, threatening to shatter my teeth. It felt like a summons, an invitation to something ancient and terrible. I kept moving, deeper into the darkness, drawn by an irresistible force. The smell of burnt hair was overwhelming, clinging to the back of my throat, choking me. My boots sank into the floor, the surface giving way beneath my weight. It wasn't solid anymore. It wasn't concrete, or metal, or even earth. It was something else entirely. Something alive. Something waiting. The metal scraping on concrete. The metal scraping on concrete. The metal scraping on concrete. My fingers traced the cool, damp metal of the nameplate. Asterisk 1910S Subway. The embossed numerals were worn smooth, the lettering a faded, sickly green. The air, already thick with a scent of burnt hair and something akin to wet stone, seemed to press against me. A physical weight. I registered the nameplate not as information, but as a texture, a feeling against my fingertips. A clinical observation, devoid of emotional resonance. The whistling stopped, abruptly. The high-pitched keening vanished, leaving a void in the auditory landscape, a silence so complete it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't the absence of sound, but a sudden vacuum, a pressure differential that threatened to implode my inner ear. A metallic taste bloomed on my tongue, bitter and sharp. I blinked, trying to reorient myself. The bread-like substance clinging to my face felt heavier, a suffocating mask. My hands. I looked down. The skin was shifting, not in the way flesh moves, with the subtle undulation of muscle and bone. This was a hardening, a solidification. The fine hairs on the backs of my hands vanished, replaced by a smooth metallic sheen. I flexed my fingers and the movement was different, less yielding. A faint, internal fine click accompanied each movement, like gears meshing. The smell of burnt hair intensified, emanating not from the tunnel walls, but from my own skin. I raised my hands, turning them slowly in the dim light filtering from the tunnel entrance. The skin was transforming, coalescing into a dull, brassy metal. The knuckles were thickening, the joints fusing. I observed the process with detached curiosity, cataloging each subtle change in color and texture. It wasn't painful, not precisely. It was unsettling. A violation of the expected order of things. The metal wasn't T uniform. It seemed to grow organically, like a fungus consuming flesh. The cat appeared, a silent glide from the darkness, its white fur a stark contrast to the grey grime of the tunnel walls. It paused, its blood-stained paws leaving faint crimson tracks on the damp floor. It regarded me with eyes that reflected no light, twin pools of obsidian. The metallic scent intensified. The cat's gaze was analytical, as if it were assessing the efficiency of my transformation, as if it were cataloguing the data. It let out a soft, rasping futchi, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. My fingers were almost entirely brass now. The transformation was accelerating. I could feel the rigidity spreading up my forearms, the subtle shift in bone structure. The whistling, though absent, left a phantom resonance in my skull, a dull ache behind my eyes. I tried to clench my fist, but the movement was restricted. The brass was binding, constricting. I registered the sensation not as discomfort, but as a mechanical limitation. The brass was cool against the bread, like material plastered to my face, a chilling contrast to the feverish warmth emanating from within my own skin. I attempted to speak, but the sound that emerged was distorted, metallic, a garbled echo of my own voice. The cat tilted its head, its ears twitching. A faint rhythmic thump resonated through the tunnel walls, a subsonic pulse that vibrated in my teeth. The floor beneath my feet felt different, less solid, a subtle give, as if the concrete were yielding to an unseen pressure. The smell of burnt hair was almost unbearable, a choking miasma that filled my lungs. The bread, like substance on my face, felt like a second skin, a suffocating membrane that prevented me from breathing properly. I instinctively tried to peel it away, but it clung to my skin with a tenacious grip. The metallic taste intensified, coating my tongue, filling my nostrils. It was the taste of decay, of rust, of something ancient and forgotten. The cat moved closer, its blood-stained paws leaving a trail of crimson on the floor. It rubbed against my brass, encrusted leg, a silent, unsettling gesture. My hands were fully transformed. Solid brass, cold and unyielding. The joints were fused, the knuckles distorted. They were no longer my hands, they were tools. Instruments. The cat let out another rasping chufty, its obsidian eyes fixed on my face. The thumpy intensified, a relentless pulse that echoed through the tunnel. The walls seemed to be closing in, the space shrinking, constricting. I felt a sense of acceptance. Not resignation, but a quiet, clinical acknowledgement of the inevitable. I reached out with my brass hands touching the tunnel wall. The surface yielded beneath my touch, soft and yielding, like the flesh of a living organism. A low groan resonated through the tunnel, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very stone itself. The bread, like substance on my face, tightened, constricting my airways. I struggled to breathe, but the material clung to my skin, preventing me from drawing a full breath. The cat let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep within my bones. The smell of burnt hair was overwhelming, a suffocating miasma that filled my lungs. The metal scraping on concrete. The metal scraping on concrete. The metal scraping on concrete. My brass knuckles pressed against the tunnel window. The metal cold and unyielding. It emitted a faint, dry rasp as I pushed, a sound like grit under a stone. The glass beneath my touch yielded slightly, soft and warm like living tissue. I registered the sensation without emotion, the scent of ozone and rotting flowers thick enough to taste, mingling with the ever-present burnt hair smell. My breath fogged the glass, leaving a wet handprint that vanished too quickly. The bread-like substance on my face tightened, constricting my airways with a suffocating grip. I tried to breathe deeper, but the moldy membrane clung, pulling my skin taut. The cat padded closer, its blood-stained paws leaving crimson smears on the damp concrete floor. It rubbed against my brass, encrusted leg, a silent, unsettling gesture. Its obsidian eyes reflected the dim light, unblinking. A new sound began, low and persistent. Not whistling, not thump, just the relentless scrape of metal on concrete, a sound like a rusty hinge grinding in slow motion. It came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in my teeth, making the floor feel like it was shifting beneath my feet. The scent of burnt hair intensified, sharp and acrid, coating my tongue. I flexed my fingers, brass against brass, and the movement was stiff, precise, accompanied by a faint internal funk-like click. The joints were fully fused now. The transformation was complete. I raised my hands, turning them slowly in the weak light filtering from the tunnel entrance. The brass was dull, cold, reflecting nothing. The skin was gone, replaced by a smooth, unyielding surface. I felt no pain, only a deep, unsettling awareness of the change. The cat let out a soft, rasping shuff-off, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It tilted its head, blood dripping from its paws onto the concrete. The scent of ozone grew stronger, mixed with the cloying rot of decaying flowers. My vision blurred at the edges, the tunnel walls seeming to pulse faintly. The metal scraping sound grew louder, a rhythmic thus-scrape-scratch that echoed in my bones. I tried to move toward the tunnel entrance, but the floor felt different. Not concrete, not stone. It yielded slightly under my feet, a subtle give like soft flesh. The scent of burnt hair was overwhelming now, choking, filling my lungs. The bread mold on my face felt like a second skin, tight and suffocating. I instinctively reached up to peel it away, but it clung stubbornly. My brass fingers made a sharp, metallic clink against the mold. The cat watched, eyes like black holes. The sound of the metal scraping on concrete intensified. It wasn't just the floor now, it was the walls, the ceiling. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the sound. The scent of rotting flowers turned sickly sweet, cloying. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The tunnel entrance seemed closer, yet the light was fading. The cat padded silently to the window beside me, its blood-stained paws leaving faint, crimson tracks on the glass. It stared out, as if waiting. My fingers pressed against the glass, leaving wet handprints. The ozone scent was sharp in my nose, mixed with the rotting flowers. The burnt hair smell was a constant undercurrent. I felt the cool glass, the wetness of my own handprint, the faint vibration of the metal scraping sound resonating through my bones. The cat let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated deep in my chest. The scent of ozone and burnt hair filled my lungs. The wet handprints on the window glowed faintly in the dim light. The metal scraping sound grew louder, a relentless sieving scrape-scratchy that echoed in the tunnel. The wet handprints on the window emitted the ozone and rotting flowers scent amidst the burnt hair breeze.